for you to have a victory? Well, because the purpose of life is growth. That is the purpose of life. And we know that instinctively. And if you go out in nature, that's all that nature is doing, is nature is growing. But you're right, we as human beings, at a certain point, we're like, I just want everything to stay the same. I just want to be comfortable, right? But growth is what both gives you the deepest joy in life, and it's also what protects your future. And, if you're a parent, you have to model growth for your kids. If you're a teacher, you've got to take risks in the classroom and model growth for your students. And so what that means is you've got to identify for you what a victory would be, what's something that you want to succeed at, and then figure out ways that that victory becomes possible, not probable, but possible. Do you want me to talk about the difference between possibility and probability, or is that something? Okay.
Yeah.
So this is something I found totally fascinating. I don't know if you guys will find this fascinating because you're maybe not quite as weird and nerdy as me. But there's a difference in your brain between possibility and probability. So if you're thinking about probability, that goes on in a totally different part of your brain than when you're thinking about possibility. And what's interesting about that is if you ask most people today to explain the difference between possibility and probability, they'll probably tell you, well, a possibility is a kind of low probability. So, a possibility is probably like maybe 10% or maybe 5% or 1% or something like that. And the reality is no, it's totally different. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is that probability is calculated off of things that have happened in the past. So you can go through all those events that have happened in the past, you can correlate them with other factors, and you can compute the likelihood that they'll happen again. This is what computers do. They think in probability. A possibility is something that has never happened before, but could happen because it doesn't break the laws of your environment. The classic example of this is end of the 19th century, world's greatest statistician. His name is Lord Kelvin. He's the president of the Royal Society. He's so good at math that he's basically the first computer just by himself. And he sits down and he proves mathematically that there will never be an airplane. Why? Well, because there'd never been an airplane before. So the probability of there being an airplane was zero. And you can go and you can read this. He actually says this in 1895. He comes out definitively. And then they came back to him in 1902 and they said, are you still sure about this? He's like, absolutely. Look at the math. The math proves it. And then what happened a year later, of course, the Wright brothers, they flew. And why is it the Wright brothers were able to fly? Because they were thinking in possibility. And one of the reasons they were thinking impossibility was that they were reading these imaginative stories that were on their father's bookshelf. And so when you think about your own future, what's important is to start to think in possibility, to start to imagine all the different stories that your life could take, and to realize that the power of story in the human brain is not to identify a single true narrative. This is why people are suspicious of stories nowadays, is they'll say, well, you know what? When people start thinking in narrative, then they just take all the data and they use it to fit their narrative, right? You'll hear this all the time, particularly from a certain kind of mathematician or economist that doesn't like story. They'll talk about stories are just forms of bias, is what they'll say. Well, only if you're misusing story. Because if you're using story appropriately, you don't have a single story in your brain that you think is the most probable story. You instead have multiplying stories, all that are possible. And so when you're thinking about how you can win in the future, what you're doing there is you're thinking, what are all the different ways that I can achieve my goals? What are all the different paths that I can take? And this makes people nowadays nervous when they start thinking about that, because people nowadays, we've been conditioned by our school system and by the way that business works and by the way that computers and math works to think, no, there's got to be a right answer. It's got to be efficient. I know it's got to work. But when you look at children, children are energized by thinking of possibilities. Children love the idea that there are all these different options, And if you can get your own brain back into that state of just thinking, what are some different ways that I could win this year?
Yeah.
Then when you start to do that, you start to unlock this ability of your brain to imagine these futures. And what you'll find is that the victory you achieve is probably not one of the ones you imagined, but it's remarkable in its own way.